Hello and welcome to Baiju's Exam Prep IAS. Before we begin today's session of the Hindu analysis, an important announcement. Baiju's IAS is coming up with an important workshop for all of you where our faculty will be discussing with you the most effective way to make notes if you are preparing for the civil services examination. The workshop will be held on 16th of Jan at 11 a.m. sharp. The link to register for the workshop is given in the description of the video. Now let's begin our session with the first article that talks about the need to restructure and reform the way that the Election Commission of India is appointed. As you know, the Election Commission of India is a constitutional body, and the constitution says that it comprises of the chief election commissioner and as many election commissioners as the president may appoint from time to time. Till 1989, it used to be a single member body, and then since 1993, it has continuously been a three-member body with the chief election commissioner and two other election commissioners. Now, the problem here is, as per almost every expert, the Election Commission of India is one of the most important constitutional bodies of India. At the end of the day, the entire democratic structure of India is dependent on the transparency and the robustness of the Election Commission. However, the appointment method of the Election Commission of India does not indicate that. As you would know, the appointment of the Chief Election Commissioner or the other election commissioners is done by the President of India on the advice of the Prime Minister and the other Council of Ministers. Means, apart from the executive, apart from the people in power, there is no one else who has any role to play in the appointment of the Election Commission. The opposition parties have no role to play, the judiciary has no role to play, and thus this creates an atmosphere of the Election Commission of India being a bit biased towards the ruling establishment rather than being fair for everyone. The question becomes even more important in the view of a recent occurrence. That is, recently the Prime Minister had summoned the Election Commission of India to meet. Now, this is a very unusual occurrence because the Election Commission of India is considered as an independent body who does not have to follow the directions given by the government. Now, before you go into the details of this article, do remember one interesting point. This article is written by the chairman of All India Congress Committee. So, when you see that the article says that the Election Commission of India has been favoring one single party, don't take it on the word of the author here because this is just an opinion of someone who belongs to the opposition party. So he says that since 2019 general elections, especially, there have been allegations that the Election Commission of India has been favoring the ruling party when it comes to deciding on the election schedule or when it comes to deciding the number of phases in which the elections will be held. We all famously know the case of Ashok Lavasa. Let me tell you who is Ashok Lavasa. So Ashok Lavasa used to be one of the two election commissioners at the time of the 2019 general elections. Now, during the campaigning, there were a lot of objectionable speeches given by the Prime Minister and the current Home Minister, that is Shri Amit Shah. The Election Commission of India, while preparing a report about whether or not to take any action against these speeches, in those meetings, Ashok Lavasa, that is one of the election commissioners, had raised objections and he was of the view that certain action should be taken against the Prime Minister and the other leaders who are giving such speeches on the communal lines. However, since the other two people in the commission were not in favor of this action, there was no action taken. But Ashok Lavasa wanted to make his views public and wanted that his views should also be a part of the report. Although no action was taken against the government, but just a few weeks later, there were a lot of inquiries that were opened up against Ashok Lavasa, against his son, against his wife and the companies where they were working and they had any shareholding. That was considered as a witch hunt by the opposition parties. Ashok Lavasa finally went out of India and started to work at the Asian Development Bank. Now, the problem with the current process of the appointment of the Election Commission is that the government usually appoints those IAS officers or central services officers who are close to the government, and the government then expects them to be loyal to them because of the election process. There is no objection that can be raised from anyone outside the government, and that is why the authors are of the view that there is a need to change the method of election of the election commissioners to maintain the accountability and transparency in their working. The Article 324 of the Constitution says that the number and the tenure of the election commissioners shall be subject to provisions made by law of the Parliament. The problem, however, is that no robust law has been made by the parliament so far. So, for instance, tomorrow, if the president feels that I should remove the two election commissioners, he can easily do that just by taking consent of the chief election commissioner. In effect, the other two election commissioners do not really have a security of tenure. The safety and security of tenure is only given to the chief election commissioner. The big loophole here is that the parliament has still not made a robust law about the election of the other election commissioners and their method of working. So far, no change has been made in the working of the election commission except increasing their strength from 1 to 3. There have been multiple petitions filed in the Supreme Court against the current process of appointment of the election commissioners, saying that this goes against Article 14, Article 324, and against the basic structure of the Constitution. These petitions say that the executive alone, executive means the ruling government alone, cannot appoint quasi judicial bodies. There has to be much more accountability and the process should be much more transparent. In fact, there have been multiple committees in the past that have also suggested changes. For instance, in 1975, Justice Tarkunde Committee said that the election commissioners should be appointed on the advice of a committee having Prime Minister, the Lok Sabha opposition leader, and the Chief Justice of India. Similarly, the 1990 Dinesh Goswami Committee and the Law Commission in 2015 report had similar views. Not just this, the second ARC also in one of the reports said that the Law Minister, the Deputy Chairman of Rajya Sabha, should also be a part of a committee that finally decide who shall be the Election Commissioner of India. I don't mean to compare anybody or demean anybody, but you have to understand that there are many other institutions in India whose working may not be as significant as the Election Commission, which have a proper committee for their appointment. The Lokpal, the CVC, all these bodies are appointed only after consultation with a committee that has members from the opposition also and from judiciary also in certain cases. The same is also the case with the National Human Rights Commission. When such bodies can have a committee on appointment, why not the same method is followed for the Chief Election Commissioner? Either the government does not think it is very important or the government thinks it is so important that they want to control it and they don't want anyone else to give an opinion in that. The Supreme Court also in 2017 remarked that the selection process for the election commissioners must be transparent and we expect the parliament to make a law on the same. At the end of the day, no government can run properly and transparently if it does not follow the concept of separation of powers. Thus, the executive should not control a body that decides who will become the member of the legislative. That is why this is a clear sign of not being good on the concept of separation of powers. Now, I want to talk about two more things. First, I want to give examples of some other nations who have a different process as compared to India while appointing their election commissioners. Like for South Africa, election commissioners are appointed by the president on the recommendation of the National Assembly. This National Assembly is an inter-party committee, so it has representation not just on the ruling party but from the opposition as well. In Canada, the Chief Electoral Officer of Elections Canada is appointed by the House of Commons, similar to our Lok Sabha, for a non-renewable 10-year term. And to protect their independence, they report directly to the parliament and not to the government. In the US also, there are 6 federal election commissioners who are appointed by the president, but on the advice and consent of the Senate, that is their upper house. A similar process or a mixture of any of these can be used in case of India as well. Now, whenever we talk about the Election Commission of India, its transparency, accountability, etc., it is always important to remember the contribution of very important person called Mr. T.N. Seshan. In 1990, T.N. Seshan became the Chief Election Commissioner of India at the time when Mr. Chandrasekhar was our Prime Minister. Now, he was an IAS officer. In fact, he is said to be the topper of the 1955 batch of the IAS officers, considered to be a very strict, upright person, a no-nonsense person who once said that I eat politicians for my breakfast. He is credited for changing the way that the Election Commission of India works. Before 1990 also, the Election Commission of India was always supposed to be an independent body. It was supposed to decide on everything regarding elections on its own without taking any advice from the government. However, in 1970s and 1980s, in states such as UP and Bihar, there was a common practice of booth capturing and a lot of violence used to occur very regularly in the elections. And the Election Commission of India, unfortunately, did not really take any action, and they were seen as being biased against the ruling party. The political parties also did not think very highly of the Election Commission and thought of this institution as just a formality. However, everything changed when T.N. Seshan became the Chief Election Commissioner in 1990. He was the one who started taking extremely strict actions against anyone involved in political violence. Not just this, he in fact asked the Prime Minister Narasimha Rao to suspend two of his ministers who he said were influencing voters in the wrong manner. Although the Prime Minister did not suspend the ministers, but he assured T.N. Seshan that this thing will never happen again. Not just the ruling party, the opposition also was very unhappy with T.N. Seshan because he was following the rules that were made to the letter. He was strictly following the model code of conduct, which the political parties did not like. Now, what happened was in 1993, when the opposition parties were fed up of him, they thought that we need to reduce his power. Now, how do you reduce the powers of the Chief Election Commissioner? You cannot remove him because what reason would you share with the public? Are you removing him because he's doing the job too good? No. So instead of this, the government said that to help you, we are appointing two more election commissioners so that your workload gets reduced. In reality, the two election commissioners were appointed so that the powers of the chief election commissioners were brought down. The rule was that every decision of the Election Commission of India will be taken by a majority. So if the two new election commissioners don't agree with the chief election commissioner, then whatever the two election commissioners say, that will be followed. And the government appointed those people as election commissioners who were considered to be closer to the government. T.N. Seshan was very angry with this. In fact, he even went to the Supreme Court in 1995 saying that I want to remove these two election commissioners. Since I am the chief election commissioner, you should listen to me. But the Supreme Court did not listen to him. And since then, the Election Commission of India is a three-member body. But even today, whenever we talk about election reforms or we talk about the transparency of the Election Commission of India, we always remember that it was T.N. Seshan who gave this name to the Election Commission of India. It was only after him that the election commissioners in India were respected much more, and the Election Commission of India followed the model code of conduct much more strictly after that. The next article that we have talks about the trust deficit that exists right now between the media houses that really publish the news and the tech companies such as Google and Facebook, who are not letting them earn a lot of money by taking their news and publishing on their platform by offering just peanuts in return to the media companies. This problem of tech companies versus the media companies is not just in India. Many countries, for example, South Korea, Australia, France, etc., are facing these issues. In India specifically, the Competition Commission of India has decided to investigate Google after allegations that they have broken the antitrust law. This is not the first time that the Competition Commission of India is investigating activities of Google. In fact, this is the third time that there is an investigation on Google. I'll tell you the first two times as well. Similar things are happening with Google and Facebook in France, Australia, and other companies. In India, the complaint was filed by India's Digital News Publishers Association. They said that Google is abusing its dominance by not giving them a fair share of advertising money and by not giving them adequate information. As you know, most of the people today get their news from Google, Facebook, etc., although they are not the real publishers of the news. They just give a link and then you get redirected from that link to the original website of these news media. However, bulk of the advertising money on the websites of this news media only goes to Google and Facebook, and a very small share is actually given to these media companies. Not just this, on Facebook, etc., when you see an article of any newspaper, you just see the headline. That is the news snippet. Mostly people don't really read the entire article, they only want to read the headline. So you are not even clicking on that to go to the website of the newspaper. So the newspaper website is not earning from you. But Facebook, Google, etc. are able to keep you on their website just by showing the news snippet. Media houses are not even paid for those news snippets, which is again a concern. Australia was the first country that came up with a law to force Google and Facebook to pay the news publishers, because at the end of the day, it is the news publishers that spend money, give salary to journalists and news writers, and produce the news. And that news is freely taken up by Google and Facebook without even sharing any of their revenue. After Australia passed this law, India and many other countries are also in the process of passing a similar law to protect the interest of the media houses in their countries. Now, as I said, this is not the first time that the Competition Commission of India is actually investigating a matter against Google. In fact, this is the third time that they are doing this. The first issue came up when it was found out that when you go to the Google Play Store and you search for mobile payment apps such as PhonePe, Paytm, etc., the Google Play Store always shows you Google Pay as a first result. They almost force the people indirectly to download the Google Pay app rather than other apps such as PhonePe or Paytm. Not just this, in 2018, the Competition Commission of India fined $21 million to Google for search bias. That is, when you search something on Google, Google tries to give results of those websites at a higher position that are related to Google or that pay more money to Google. So Google is indulging in an abuse from a dominant position in the market. Now you may argue that Google is a private company, right? So for example, if you go and Google best plumbers in my city, then Google is a private company. It has the right to show whatever results that they want. The plumbers that have paid more money to Google, they should come up. It is in interest of Google, right? But that is not how it works. As per the governments, Google or such companies have become so big that they can't cheat their customers. They can't act just like a private company. They have to maintain an even playing field and they can't manipulate their search engine. It is alleged that Google has also been misusing its dominant position to reduce the ability of smartphone manufacturers to opt for some other operating system as compared to Android. Thus, Google is used to such kind of lawsuits not just in India but across the world. India also has an antitrust law called the Competition Law, which aims to protect trade and commerce from unfair restraints, monopolies, and price fixing. It was originally passed in the year 2002 and replaced the old 1969 law. The Competition Act was passed on the recommendation of the Raghavan Committee. Now, as I said, the issue of tech companies versus news media or the governments is a worldwide phenomenon. Let me give you a few examples. Australia, as I said, recently passed a law that requires Google and Facebook to enter into payment negotiations with the media companies for using their content. So, an authority will be formed that will represent most of the media companies. They will negotiate with Google and Facebook so that the lesser media companies who are not in a position to negotiate can also get a fair price. On the other hand, Google, Facebook, these companies say that in fact we are benefiting the media company by giving them more traffic. For example, they say that no one will go ahead and open the Hindu website anyway. We are sharing the link of the Hindu website on other websites on our pages. Only then people are coming to these websites. So rather than asking for money, the media companies should be thanking us. Although Google does pay a certain amount to media companies, it is very, very small as compared to revenue that the tech companies make. Secondly, the small media companies anyways are not really in a position to negotiate a good deal with Google. So if you are a large media company, a large newspaper or a media house, you may negotiate a better deal. As a result of this, what Google has done is they have tried to start a new platform called the Google News, in which they are collaborating with 450 publications and asking them to publish their news directly on the Google News platform, and then it will be based on a revenue sharing model. This is open in India also. If you just go to Google News, you will see a website where links of all the newspapers and media houses are given and you can read the articles, and that is on a revenue sharing model. The European Union also, after Australia, passed a similar law saying that if Google publishes news of news media without giving them money, it will be considered as against the copyright rules. And Google has now stopped displaying news snippets in EU because of this particular law. In fact, when other countries also threatened Google with the same, Google stopped its Google News service in Spain, saying that we don't want to pay publishers any money in Spain. So the reaction of Google is different in different countries depending upon how important and significant they think that that particular country is. Now we have to see if Indian government passes such a law, what would be the reaction of companies such as Google and Facebook while tackling that particular issue. The next article talks about the ongoing situation between Russia and Western countries with respect to what is happening in Ukraine. Recently, the US and Russia held their talks about NATO expansion and about Russia increasing its deployment at the Ukraine border. The talks were inconclusive, but the negotiations will go on the same topic. It is considered as a victory for Russia because it has forced US to at least come at the negotiating table and consider Russia as an equal in the ongoing matter. We have discussed this earlier also, how Russia wants to stop the expansion of NATO in Eastern Europe because it is too close to Russia and wants NATO to go back to its 1991 level. That is, any Eastern European country that has joined NATO after 1990 should again come out of NATO. That is what Russia wants as its major demand from the US and NATO. US, on the other hand, obviously does not want any potential NATO member to go away. Thus, the challenge here is to find a common ground. Russia, as we have discussed, views NATO and its expansion as a threat. In fact, Ukraine is not the first country that has had to face violence from Russia when it had to join NATO. In 2008, when Georgia was considering joining NATO, they also had to face military action from Russia. The same happened in 2014 when Crimea was taken away from Ukraine by Russia because Ukraine was considering joining NATO as a priority. However, as per the article, practically speaking, in the ongoing situation, it does not seem really possible for either Ukraine or Georgia to join NATO anytime soon because of the ongoing conflict. Another interesting argument here is that it will not be viable for Russia to continue the ongoing situation for a long time. Ever since Russia decided to annex Crimea, it has been facing economic sanctions from West, and thus its own economic condition with the sanctions and the pandemic has not been great. Thus, for Russia also, this ongoing standoff is coming at a huge economic cost, and Russia also would want an end to this as soon as possible. But just that they don't want to appear weak in front of the world, and thus they are sticking to their demands. Now, why exactly Ukraine wants to join NATO? Ukraine, as we know, was one of the members of the USSR. In fact, it was the second largest nation after Russia. Now, when USSR disintegrated in 1990, Ukraine had to make plans for its own economic development. In the decade of the 1990s, it realized the fact that the economic assistance from Russia is not enough for Ukraine, and many people in Ukraine wanted to have better ties with the Western nations, including Western Europe and USA, for their own economic development. Thus, Ukraine first decided to join NATO in 2014. That led to a strong reaction from Russia and annexation of Crimea. The same was repeated in 2021. The Ukrainian president in April urged NATO to speed up the country's membership in NATO. Ukraine was hoping that after it joins NATO, it will put an end to its fighting with pro-Russian separatists. Now, since 2014, when Russia annexed Crimea, Ukraine's government has had to fight internally with a lot of people who are called as pro-Russian separatists, who want other parts of Ukraine also to go to Russia. Although the Russian government says that they are not connected to these separatists, but the reality is that these separatists are getting some support from Russia one way or the other. In fact, Ukraine has accused Russia of bringing thousands of military personnel on its northern and eastern borders since 2014. The Russian nations have come to the help of Ukraine, but in reality, no nation wants to engage in a face-off with Russia or any other country for that matter. Since 2014, India has remained pretty quiet on the issue. We have not condemned the intervention of Russia in Crimea, and we have kept a low profile on this issue overall. NATO, as you know, is a military alliance established after the Second World War to ensure America's sphere of influence remains strong in the western part of Europe at least. The key provision of this treaty is the Collective Security Clause, which comes under Article 5. This says that if one member of the alliance is attacked in Europe or in North America, it is considered as an attack against all the members. Thus, if any one of the NATO members is in danger, everyone else will come to save it. This effectively puts Western Europe under the nuclear umbrella of US. Ukraine was hoping that this umbrella extends to them. Only once in the history of NATO has this Article 5 been invoked. That was after the World Trade Center attacks in the US. Also remember, NATO does not extend to a civil war or internal coup if it is happening in a member nation. only an external threat will be considered as a threat and all other members will come to protect the nation. The next article talks about India's transition phase. As per the authors here, India's demographic dividend means the advantage that India had being one of the youngest nations in the world is on a decline now, and India must act fast if it has to take advantage of the same. In simple terms, demographic dividend means since the average age of country is extremely low, for example, right now the average age of the country is between 28 and 29. That means the number of people in the working class who can work and afford to pay taxes is extremely high. This is a time that the government must take advantage of this and ensure that there is prosperity across all sectors. However, this average age of India is increasing at a steady pace, and by 2036 our average age will become 36. Thus, Indian government must act fast now. The author here say that household and national investment in youth and children always goes a long way in ensuring economic development for the country. Recent findings of the National Family Health Survey talk about the declining fertility rate in India. That means that number of dependent population in India is on an increase. Means the people who don't work or don't pay taxes, the people in the old age who are more dependent on the government subsidies and on the young people in their household is increasing. At the same time, the people who are young and can work effectively are on a decline. If the government does not introduce good policies right now, it would lead to rising unemployment and economic risks in the long run. In very simple terms, the countries that have higher fertility rate will always have lower average age. For example, in Afghanistan, the average age is not even 20 right now because of the increasing fertility rate. Pakistan's median age is still lesser than India because again the fertility rate of Pakistan is much higher as compared to India. So as we control our fertility rate, our average age will automatically keep on increasing. India thus is in the middle of this transition. The authors say that the kind of benefit that India was hoping for to get from our demographic dividend from the young population that we had was not really equal to the other Asian nations. The other Asian nations such as Singapore, Thailand, Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, etc. were able to get much more result from their young population as compared to India. The reason why they were successful is they focus on empowering youth by focusing on their education, health and developing their skills, something that India has ignored for a long time now. The article here gives certain suggestions to the government about what can the government do as a whole to make sure that we take advantage of this ship that is leaving our shores very fast. Number one, India must undertake a holistic study to find out how much are we investing in per capita consumption. Means the youth, the children in India, how much are they consuming and how does it compare to other nations in the world. For example, a child in India consumes 60% of what an adult man consumes. In comparison, in China, a child consumes 85% of what an adult man consumes. Thus, the amount of nutrition going into the body of Indian youth and child is lower as compared to other nations around the world. The other lesson is to invest more in children and adolescents to meet their nutritional needs. As you have seen, Indian government is fighting to tackle the problem of anemia as it exists throughout the country. There has to be a greater focus on transitioning from secondary education to universal skilling and entrepreneurship. For a very long time, we have been fighting this issue that our education is focused more on theory as compared to skill building, which is necessary today. We need to make health investments. That is, the infrastructure of health must be much more robust, much more better. Why is it that a person, if he has some amount of money, always avoids going to a government hospital? Why is it that anyone who can afford it would never want to visit a government doctor or a government clinic? Why is it a tendency to opt for private hospitals even though you may have to take a loan for that? That is because you don't trust the health infrastructure there. That has to be improved. Our reproductive healthcare also needs to improve because a child at a very early age, since the time of his birth, has to be taken care of for a much better future. We also have to ensure accessories needed for family planning are available at a much greater scale in India, such as contraceptions and other medicines. We also have to focus on gender equality In India, the number of women involved in our workforce is much lower as compared to nations such as China, Philippines, and Thailand, which is extremely bad for India. When such a large population of a country which is educated, which has the same skill set as the other half of the population, but is not working or not contributing to the country's GDP, it will never help the country in going forward. Last but not the least, in India, the access to education for boys is much more as compared to the girls. This also needs to change. You might argue that now the situation is improving, but you have to understand you may be living in an urban city, in a metro city. Around you, you may say that, oh, the women are working, they are going to colleges and schools, the situation is improving. That is right for your urban city. But you have to understand India still lives in the villages. Unless the situation improves in the villages, you cannot expect India to become better. Just take a very simple example. If your father comes back home at 11 in the night, would you ask him where were you? In most cases, not. But if your mother comes back to home after work at 10 or 11 p.m. in the night, you would ask her a lot of questions. Where were you? Are you all right? Out of concern. But still, there is a tendency of not seeing the males and the females as equals, neither in the family and nor in the society, which needs to change. Now, there is a very interesting data point here which I need to share with you. These are the oldest nations in the world in terms of the median age, that is the average age. Japan is considered as the oldest nation in the world with median age of 48.6. Only 17% of Japanese population is below 20 years of age. In India, the median age is somewhere between 28 and 29 right now. Then there are countries such as Germany, Italy, Hong Kong, Portugal, etc. Now there are two ways to look at it. One way to look at it is these are the countries where the working population would be very low, where most of the people are those who are dependent on government subsidies and on the taxes paid by others. But do you see something interesting here? This list also has some of the most developed and advanced countries in the world. Japan, Germany, Italy, Hong Kong, Austria, Spain, South Korea. These are the nations that have excellent family health indicators, that have excellent facilities and are still going strong. Now, you may argue that the economic growth rate of Japan is slowing down, but you also have to understand that in today's world, most of the employment is dependent on machines and technology rather than the people and the people's age. So, on one hand, you can say that having a young population is always an advantage. But when you look at the list of these nations and understand the fact that even the older nations are not really behind anyone. For example, the youngest nation in the world is Niger, the African nation which has an average of below 16, one of the least developed nations in the world. Thus, there has to be a fine balance between looking at the demographic dividend and the skill set and the development that a particular country has or has achieved over the years. The next article that we have talks about what would it need for India to produce Apple that have become the world leaders. This is written in the backdrop of Apple becoming a $3 trillion company, which is even more than the entire GDP of India. Most countries in the world together don't have such a GDP as is the market capitalization of Apple, that is $3 trillion right now. The author says that if India also wants to go in the same direction, we have to focus on our universities and making them the center of research and development. Now, let me share with you a few points that you need to understand here. If you look at some of the best universities across the world, let's take the example of Harvard. We always have heard that Harvard is one of the most prestigious universities in the world. Now, the interesting point that differentiates Harvard and institutes in India is research and the funding that they have. In US or Western countries, it is very common that the alumni of the institutions donate a lot of money to them. In fact, there are examples when people die, in their will, they write down that the money and the property that I have will go to my college, not to my children, not to my family. And it's a very common occurrence. Do you imagine such thing happening in India? Harvard has donations from many corporates across the world, including Tata. There is a Tata Hall inside the Harvard Business School, which was built after $50 million were donated to Harvard from Tata. You don't see such kind of a practices happening in India, number one. The second is you need to understand the concept of research. When you say the university should be hub for research, what do you mean? Let's say I have an idea that I can build a mobile phone whose battery will be able to run the electricity of the entire house. That will be the power of that battery. Now, if I have to conduct research for that, I would obviously need a lot of money, right? Now, when I conduct research, I might be successful, I might not be successful. So, for conducting a research, I will not go to the bank and ask for a loan, right? Because what if it fails? I will not be able to give the loan back. This is where universities come in. Universities need to have enough funding and support so that they can give funds to their students who want to research on new technology, understanding that it might all come down to zero. Like when the coronavirus crisis hit, there were hundreds of companies that started working on the vaccines. Some experiments failed, some experiments succeeded. The experiments that failed, they lost millions and billions of dollars. But that was a part of the research, because even if one experiment out of the 5 or 10 are successful, they will even out everything else. That is why the universities should have a good amount of funding from the government, from the corporate sector, and we should not be afraid of failure, because when you are researching on something, you are bound to have unsuccessful experiments and you're bound to lose some money. This is what we have not understood in our culture till now. There's a need to become research and development driven economy and understand the role of universities in that. The author says that a good beginning can be connecting nearby institutions. So, for example, there are 5 or 6 colleges in Noida or Ghaziabad. One of them may have a good mechanical lab, one of them may have a good electrical lab with good resources. So let them use each other's resources. Let them collaborate so that the students can have the best of both worlds and they can optimize the resources until one university has everything under its roof. Because building such institutions, infrastructure, etc., requires a lot of money in the beginning, the initial funding has to come from the side of the government only. But once from these institutions startup companies emerge, they can later on be financed by private investors. But the first push has to come from the government side. This is what the author is saying. Not just this, for building a good company, you don't just need tech, you also need legal help. For example, if you have made something new, how to get a patent, how to get a trademark or a copyright, how to preserve it so that no one else copies it, how to register your company, all that is something that the experts should share with the students rather than having the students to find out everything. The government must focus on funding institutions and also importantly inviting world class faculty members. The university incubators means platform that give funding to startups, etc., to begin their journey. They need freedom to connect with the other funders. Government should allow the universities to connect with the corporates and ask them for funding for their own startups. We also should have a common law that if in a university a student is researching and he had a great success, now he's launching his company, how much of the ownership of the company should be with the university, because they were the ones who funded the project. This again is a very common structure in US and Europe. When a student researches something in the university, they are successful in that, they usually give certain ownership or certain shares to their university because it supported them during their research time. This can also be in a law in India. Also, when a new product is found, who will own the intellectual property rights? For that also we can pass a law. In 2008, there was a bill introduced called Protection and Utilization of Public Funded Intellectual Property Rights, but it could not be passed. The authors say that we can go back to that bill and see if it can be changed as per today's requirement. Also, the focus should not just be on STEM. STEM means science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. We should focus equally on liberal arts, and universities must offer courses in all these spheres and not just to those people who want to build programs, robots, and apps. To sum it up, great universities that lead to great companies and products need world-class R&D infrastructure, best faculties from around the world, and a focus on vocational training and skill development rather than forcing a student to take up a certain course even if he or she is not interested in reading that. There's a very famous story about Steve Jobs. When he was in college, he was not getting a lot of interest in his classes. So he opted out and took a course of calligraphy class after he saw some posters on his campus. He saw how exactly are the different fonts made, how you can use these fonts to differentiate with each other, etc. These fonts, on the basis of these classes that he had taken, became the foundation of the fonts that you now see in all the products of Apple. So it was done because he was interested in this. He was not forced to take up certain courses in college, and it led to a great discovery. Again, something like this should be followed in Indian universities as well. Now, although the article sums it up perfectly well, but still, let me take you through some of the other problems that we have in our higher education. The first problem, as we discussed earlier, is of funding. It is expected from the government side to put in the initial money that we require, but that has not been the case. Our spending on higher education specifically has been extremely low. The demand is for it to be at least 6% of the GDP, but we are nowhere near that. Thus, education, or specifically higher education, has never been a priority area for any government. You would have never seen any political party coming to you saying that vote for us and we will improve your colleges, or we will provide you more research funding in the colleges. That is just not something that we hear in India, and it is a long way away in the future. Then we also have a low enrollment ratio. The gross enrollment ratio in higher education is only 24.5. That is, out of the 100 youth that are eligible to take admission in higher education, only 24 and a half are pursuing that. So a lot of youth are not taking up higher education opportunities anyway. There's lack of research that we had just talked about. There are regulatory issues also. We have regulatory bodies such as the UGC and AICTC, but rather than introducing new ideas, they are more about controlling the universities and ensuring that no one goes out of their way to introduce something new. There is lack of autonomy. So even if an institute or a teacher thinks that something new should be taught to the students, they are forced to stick to the syllabus that has been defined by these regulators. And thus it is very difficult to go over and beyond for the teachers or for the people who are involved there. Some other interesting initiatives that can be taken are organizing regular events such as hackathon to bring out the skills of real life in the students, to reform the existing curriculum, make sure that learning does not just happen inside the classroom and can be accessed through online platforms such as Swayam. Teacher training also needs to happen because teachers also need to keep on improving their skill every single day. These were the articles we wanted to discuss from the Hindu newspaper today. Now a couple of practice questions. Number one, reforming the method of selection of election commissioners would go a long way in improving the credibility of Election Commission of India. Do you agree? Give suggestions regarding an improved selection process. Second, time is running out for India to take advantage of its demographic dividend. Comment. Both these questions have to be answered within 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.